They banned humanity from the Galactic Council, now they beg for forgiveness. The gavel came down before I finished my sentence. Not a gavel, exactly. The Valori used a resonance crystal struck against a hollow brass plate, and the sound it made was something between a bell and a scream. I had heard it dozens of times in my 6 years as Earth's senior diplomatic representative to the Galactic Council. But this time, the sound felt different. This time, it was meant for us. Ambassador Kale Morrow, the High Speaker, said, "You will see speaking." I closed my mouth. Around me, in that vast circular chamber carved from the living stone of Veth Prime, 47 alien delegations sat in their tiered seats and watched us. Some watched with what I had learned to recognize as pity. Others watched with satisfaction barely hidden behind practiced neutral expressions. The Valori themselves, tall and pale as winter light, sat at the center dais with the stillness of people who had already made their decision 3 days ago and were only now getting around to telling us. I looked to my left. Deputy Ambassador Lena Graves had her hands flat on the table, her jaw tight, her eyes straight ahead. She was 20 years younger than me and twice as controlled. To my right, our defense liaison, Commander Owen Farr, sat with his arms crossed and a look on his face that I recognized from the 2 years I spent on peacekeeping deployments before I ever put on a diplomat's coat. It was the look of a man who had just been told the rules of the game, had already decided the rules were unfair, and was waiting patiently for the moment he could walk off the field. The High Speaker adjusted the silver sash across her narrow shoulders and began to read. The Galactic Council of Sentient Civilizations, in accordance with Charter Provision 18, Subarticle 4, has completed its review of the human species and its conduct across 31 documented interactions with Council member civilizations. She paused to let the translator rings around the chamber catch up. The findings are as follows. Humanity presents a pattern of behavior categorized as follows: unpredictable in negotiation, irrational in conflict resolution, and dangerously adaptive in circumstances that require stable, predictable responses. Lena's hand moved half an inch closer to mine on the table. She did not touch it. She just moved it closer. Furthermore, the High Speaker continued, humanity's demonstrated capacity for rapid technological assimilation, combined with its documented history of using emotional motivation as a primary driver for decision-making, presents a systemic risk to the peace framework the Council has maintained for 600 years. 600 years. They said it like it was an achievement. Like 6 centuries of carefully managed stillness was something to be proud of. I had spent 6 years in this chamber watching species with the intelligence to reach the stars choose, again and again, to do nothing with that intelligence. To maintain. To preserve. To keep things exactly as they were because change was inconvenient. The vote was taken in closed session, the High Speaker said. 43 in favor of suspension. 2 abstentions. 2 opposed. 2 opposed. I had not known that until that moment. I wanted badly to look around the chamber and find the 2 faces that had voted for us. I kept my eyes forward instead. Effective immediately, humanity is suspended from all Council proceedings, denied docking privileges at Council-designated stations, and restricted from initiating direct communication with any current Council member civilization without prior written approval from the Review Board. She set down her notes. The suspension is open-ended and subject to review no sooner than 50 standard galactic years from this date. 50 years. I was 53 years old. That meant the suspension would be reviewed, at the earliest, when I was 103. If I lived that long. If the Review Board even bothered. The resonance crystal struck the brass plate again. The session was over. Around us, delegations began to rise and file out in their orderly, practiced way, and not one of them met our eyes. The Valori delegation departed through the central door without looking back. The Keth ambassador, a species of 7-limbed beings from the outer spiral who had always been quietly friendly to us, paused at the top of the stairs, turned, and gave a very small, slow nod in our direction. I nodded back. That was the closest thing to a farewell we received. Outside the chamber, in the wide corridor of polished obsidian stone that led back to the guest wings of the Council complex, the 3 of us walked in silence for almost a full minute before Owen spoke. 50 years, he said. Yes, I said. That is a long time, Lena said. Her voice was perfectly level. I had always admired that about her. It is, I agreed. We turned a corner and walked past a row of tall windows that looked out over the capital city of Veth Prime. The city was extraordinary, all sweeping curves and luminescent architecture, every building designed over centuries to convey stability and permanence. It was beautiful in the way that a museum is beautiful. Preserved. Intentional. Unchanging. I stopped at one of the windows and looked out at it. Behind me, Owen said, "So what do we do?" I thought about the question for a long moment. I thought about the 43 votes and the 2 abstentions and the 2 who had said no. I thought about the word they had used for us, the word that had appeared in every filing and every procedural document and now in the formal decree. Unpredictable. They had said it like it was an insult. "We go home," I said. "And then?" Lena asked. I turned away from the window and started walking again toward the docking bay where our ship was waiting. "And then we get to work," I said. I did not look back at Veth Prime as we lifted off. I did not need to. The image of that city, perfect and still and completely convinced of its own correctness, was already burned into my memory. Not as something to be angry about. As something to prove wrong. They had called us dangerous. They had looked at everything that made us human, the stubbornness, the creativity, the absolute refusal to accept a situation as permanent just because someone with authority told us it was, and they had decided those things were flaws. As our ship pushed through the atmosphere and the stars opened up around us, I made a quiet decision that I did not announce to anyone. I did not write it down or broadcast it or put it in my official report to the Secretary General. I simply decided that they were going to regret this. Not because I was angry, although I was. But because I knew something the Council had never been willing to learn about us in all the years we had attended their meetings and followed their rules and tried, politely, to be what they wanted us to be. When you tell a human being that something is impossible, or forbidden, or beyond their reach, you do not discourage them. You motivate them. We flew home. And the real work began. The first 3 years were the hardest, and I say that knowing full well that the years after them were not easy either. When we returned to Earth, the Secretary General called an emergency session of the Global Assembly, and I sat at the front of the room and delivered my report. I told them everything. The vote counts. The charges. The exact language of the decree. I read it aloud, every clause, because I believed that people deserved to hear exactly what had been said about them. There was a silence in that room after I finished that I had never heard before. Not the silence of despair. Not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of an enormous number of people doing mathematics in their heads simultaneously, calculating what this meant, what it changed, what it required. The Secretary General at the time was a woman named Clara Hutton, and she was 70 years old and had been a diplomat herself for 4 decades before rising to her current position. She let the silence run for almost 2 full minutes before she spoke. "Right," she said, in the particular tone of voice that signals the end of a problem definition phase and the beginning of a solution construction phase. "Let us talk about what we are going to build." That was the moment everything changed. The immediate practical problem was significant. Suspension from the Council meant denial of access to 43 trading partners, 12 research-sharing agreements, and the network of deep space relay stations that much of our long-range communication had depended on. We lost transit rights through 7-star systems that had served as efficient shortcuts on our established trade routes. We lost access to the joint medical database that had been invaluable during the Kareth fever outbreak 4 years earlier. The Valori fully expected these losses to cripple us. I know this because I later read the internal council projection documents, which were leaked by a mid-level Keth administrative official who, it turned out, had always thought the vote was unjust. According to those projections, humanity would spend the first decade of suspension in economic contraction, followed by a period of internal political instability, followed eventually by a formal petition to the Council for reinstatement on whatever terms the Council chose to offer. The projection was wrong on every single point. What the Council had failed to account for, and what I suspect they were simply constitutionally incapable of accounting for, was what happens to human beings when you take away their options. They had looked at our reliance on Council trade routes and seen vulnerability. They had not understood that what they were actually looking at was convenience, and that convenience and necessity are very different things. When something is convenient, you use it. When it is taken away, you build a replacement. We built replacements. The Fold Space research program had been proceeding slowly before the suspension, partly because there had never been sufficient funding urgency and partly because the Council's existing transit network made Fold Space less immediately necessary. 6 months after the suspension, the Global Assembly tripled the program's budget. 14 months after that, Dr. Nadia Voss and her team at the Johannesburg Institute achieved the first stable Fold Space corridor in human history, connecting Earth to our colony on New Carthage in a transit time of 11 hours. The Council's fastest transit route between the same 2 points had taken 4 days. I remember where I was when I heard the news. I was in my home office on the outskirts of Cape Town, reviewing draft trade proposals for our outreach to non-council species, when my communicator chimed and Lena's voice said, simply, "Nadia did it." I sat very still for a moment. Then I said, "How fast?" 11 hours, 12 minutes, Lena said. First transit. They expect to cut that in half within a year. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the ocean in the distance. Good, I said. The terraforming initiatives were equally dramatic. We had been terraforming at a moderate pace for 2 decades, but the loss of council trading partners created a direct economic incentive to increase food and resource production from our own colonial worlds. The Olympus Agricultural Collective on Mars tripled its output in 2 years through a combination of accelerated terraforming techniques and a new approach to soil chemistry developed by a 26-year-old engineer named Percy Hollis who had, before the suspension, been working on a completely unrelated atmospheric modeling project. That was something the Council's projections had also missed. They had modeled our existing researchers and existing research programs. They had not accounted for the fact that necessity has a way of redirecting human attention in ways that produce completely unexpected breakthroughs. Percy Hollis's soil chemistry work eventually led to the terraforming techniques we used on Kepler's World and Bright Station and the 4 other planets we brought to habitability in the decade that followed. But I am getting ahead of the story. The political piece was where I spent most of my time in those early years. I had retired from my formal diplomatic position after the suspension, but Clara Hutton called me back within 8 months to lead what she called the Outreach Initiative. The mission was straightforward in concept and complicated in execution: find the species that the Council had marginalized, dismissed, or outright ignored, and build genuine relationships with them. There were more of them than most people realized. The Council presented itself as the representative body of galactic civilization, and technically it was, since only Council members had formal status in interstellar law. But formal status and actual representation are different things. There were 17 species that had applied for Council membership in the last 2 centuries and been denied, most of them for reasons that, when I read through the archive proceedings, amounted to the Council deciding they were too small, too new, or too different to fit comfortably into existing frameworks. The Meth were one of them. They were a small, quiet species from a binary star system about 40 light-years from Earth, and they had been denied Council membership 60 years ago on the grounds that their planet's resources made them insufficiently economically viable as trading partners. The actual trade assessment in the denial document was 1 page long and had been written by a junior Council economist who, as far as I could tell, had never visited the system. I visited the system. The Meth were extraordinary engineers. They had developed a form of structural material that was stronger than anything in the Council's catalog and could be produced from extremely common raw materials. They had not been able to bring it to market because they had no trade relationships and no transit rights. They had been quietly developing it in isolation for 60 years, waiting for someone to notice. We noticed. The agreement we signed with the Meth was the first of what eventually became the Meridian Compact, a name proposed by Lena because, she said, it described something that connected separate points into a coherent whole. By the end of the 6th year of suspension, the compact included 17 species, covered trade, research sharing, mutual defense commitments, and medical exchange, and represented a combined economic output that was, by most honest estimates, roughly 40% of the Council's. The Council noticed this. I know they noticed because the Keth ambassador, who had become one of our most reliable informal channels of information despite the official restrictions on contact, sent a carefully worded message through an intermediary indicating that certain Council members had begun using the word concerning in closed sessions when discussing human activity. I found that deeply satisfying. Owen, who had left the defense liaison position after the suspension and gone back to active service before eventually rising to command of the newly established Meridian Fleet, put it more directly when I told him. Good, he said. Let them be concerned. They should have thought about that before they voted. He was not wrong. But I also knew, even then, that the satisfaction was a temporary thing. Something was coming. I could not have told you exactly what it was, or when, or from which direction, but 6 years of sitting in the council chamber had given me a sharp sense for the difference between genuine galactic stability and the appearance of stability maintained by refusing to look at the things that threatened it. The council had been very good at maintaining the appearance. What they had never developed was the ability to handle the reality when the appearance finally fell apart. That happened in the 7th year of our suspension, and it happened fast, and it happened in a way that none of the council's 600 years of accumulated diplomatic wisdom had prepared them for even slightly. The Croth Dominion crossed the outer veil, and everything changed. I was on New Carthage when I heard the name for the first time. New Carthage in those years had become something remarkable. When I had first visited, 12 years before the suspension, it had been a rugged outpost of about 40,000 people, its terraformed zones limited to a narrow band around the equator, its infrastructure functional rather than beautiful. Now it had a population of 2 million, a fully oxygenated atmosphere across 60% of its surface, and a capital city called Founders that had the particular energy of a place that knows it is becoming something important and has decided to enjoy the process. I had retired there after negotiating the 14th Meridian Compact Agreement, a complex resource-sharing arrangement with the Drell Collective that had taken 9 months and more patience than I had known I possessed. I was 61 years old, my knees were beginning to register complaints about the slightly higher gravity on New Carthage, and I had a house on the edge of a valley with a view of a mountain range that turned pink at sunset. I was, for the first time in many years, genuinely at rest. My communicator rang at 4 in the morning, New Carthage local time. It was Lena. She did not say hello. She said, "Have you heard the word Croth?" The name meant nothing to me. "No," I said. "You will," she said. "Something has come through the outer veil. Something large and organized and not interested in talking. The council has called an emergency session." "The council has called a session," I repeated. "And they told us about it." There was a brief pause. "No," Lena said. "The Keth ambassador told us about it. Through the usual channel." I sat up in bed and looked out through the window at the dark shape of the mountains. "How bad?" I said. "We do not know yet," she said. "But Kale." The Keth ambassador used the word desperate in a message for the first time in 7 years of correspondence. That got my attention in a way that operational data could not have. The Keth were precise communicators who chose their words carefully and rarely used terms with emotional weight in official communications. For the Keth ambassador to use the word desperate, he had to mean it. I got dressed and went to my desk and started reading everything I could find. What I found, pieced together from fragmentary reports and intercepted council communications that the Keth had quietly forwarded to us over the years as a gesture of unofficial goodwill, was this: 6 weeks earlier, a fleet of vessels unlike anything in the council's identification records had crossed the boundary of explored space from the direction of the outer veil, the dark region beyond the furthest council member systems. They had approached the Valori colony world of Sirthis Minor without transmitting identification signals or responding to hails. The Valori defensive fleet stationed there, one of the largest in council space, had moved to intercept and issued 3 formal warnings in the council's 6 most common diplomatic frequencies. The Croth fleet had responded to all 3 warnings with weapons fire. The Valori defensive fleet had fought back. They were disciplined and well-equipped and operating from a tactically sound position, and according to the after-action reports I read, their commanding admiral had made every correct decision that the Valori military doctrine prescribed. They lost 40% of their fleet in 6 hours. Sirthis Minor fell within the week. I read this and then I sat very still for a moment, because I had visited Sirthis Minor once, briefly, during a transit stop in my first year as ambassador. It had been a quiet, orderly world with a population of about 800,000 people. It had a good library and a market that sold extraordinary preserved fruits from across the council's trading zones. 800,000 people. I pushed that thought aside. There was work to do. Over the following weeks, I assembled everything I could learn about the Croth Dominion. The information was frustratingly incomplete. The Council's intelligence network, which had been built over centuries to monitor the behavior of known species within known space, had nothing on the Croth because the Croth had come from beyond the edge of that knowledge. What we could piece together from the reports of the battles that followed Sirthis Minor was a profile of an enemy that was organized, highly aggressive, and operating with technology roughly comparable to the Council's most advanced member species. What made them truly dangerous was not their technology. It was their decision-making. The Council's entire diplomatic and military framework was built on a foundation of rational actor theory. The idea was that any sufficiently advanced civilization, when presented with the costs of continued conflict versus the benefits of negotiated resolution, would eventually choose resolution. The Council had 600 years of experience reinforcing this belief, because for 600 years, every conflict they had encountered had eventually yielded to this logic. The Croft did not yield to this logic. The Council sent 3 diplomatic missions. All 3 were turned back without a response. The Council imposed trade restrictions, which meant nothing to an entity that had no existing trade relationships with the Council. They called emergency sessions and passed resolutions and issued formal condemnations, and the Croft continued their advance with the complete indifference of something that did not know the Council existed as a meaningful authority and would not have cared if it had. 3 more Council worlds fell in the 3 months after Seer this Minor. A 4th was under siege when I received the communication that I had, in some part of my mind, been expecting since the morning Lena called me about the Croft. It arrived through the standard Meridian Compact Relay Network, addressed to me personally, marked with a sender code I did not recognize. When I ran the code through our identification database, it returned a single result: the personal diplomatic seal of Thessenvor, senior speaker of the Valori External Relations Council. The message was 11 words long. Ambassador Morrow. I request a meeting. I request it as a personal favor. I read it 3 times. Then I forwarded it to Lena with a single note: set it up. Neutral ground. Nothing on New Carthage. We arranged to meet on a small research station maintained by the METH, one of our compact partners, about 12 light-years from the nearest Council border. The station was called the Still Point, which the METH had named for its position at a gravitationally stable point between 2 small star systems. It was modest and functional and completely unaffiliated with the Council, which was, I suspected, the point. I traveled there on a standard compact transport with Lena and Owen, who had taken personal leave from the Meridian fleet to be present. We arrived a day early and used the time to walk through the small observation deck and look at the stars and talk through every scenario we could think of. Owen said, "They want our help." "Yes," I said. "They will want us to pretend the last 7 years did not happen," Lena said. "They will want us to set it aside, at least," I said. "Thessenvor is not stupid enough to pretend it did not happen." "What are our terms?" Owen said. "We do not have terms yet," I said. "We listen first. We hear what they are asking for. And then we take our time." Owen nodded slowly. "Take our time," he repeated, with a small, careful smile that I understood completely. Thessenvor arrived the next morning, alone, on a vessel that bore no Council markings. He was older than I remembered, though it had only been 7 years, and something in his posture had changed. The Valori carried themselves with a particular kind of physical composure that came from a culture which considered visible emotion a form of social failure. Thessenvor still had that composure, but it sat differently on him now. It looked less like confidence and more like something he was holding onto deliberately. We met in the station's small conference room. There was no ceremony. He sat down across from me, looked me in the eyes for a long moment, and said, "The Croft Dominion has taken 4 worlds. 2 more are under immediate threat. Our combined Council fleet has engaged them 14 times and has not achieved a decisive outcome in any encounter." I said, "I know." He said, "We need help." I said, "I know that too." He set his hands flat on the table, which for a Valori was a significant gesture. It meant, roughly, that he was not here to negotiate from a position of authority. He was here simply to ask. "We need your fleet," he said. "We need your tactics. We need your way of thinking in a crisis." "Our way of thinking," I said. "Yes," he said. "The things the Council called unpredictable. Irrational. Dangerous." I said nothing. I let the silence sit there for a moment. "Ambassador Morrow," Thessenvor said, and his voice was very quiet. I was one of the 2 who voted against suspension. I had not known that until that moment. I held his gaze and said, "Why are you telling me that?" "Because I think you deserve to know," he said. "And because I am asking you for something that I have no right to ask, and I did not want to ask it from behind a false position. I thought about New Carthage at sunset. I thought about 11 words on a screen. I thought about 800,000 people on Seer this Minor. I will bring your request to the Meridian Compact Council, I said. I cannot speak for them alone. This decision belongs to all of us. Thessenvor nodded. I understand. And Thessenvor, I said, standing. When this is over, we are going to have a very long conversation about the terms of a permanent arrangement. Not a reinstatement. A new arrangement. He looked at me for a moment. Yes, he said. I expected that. I left the conference room and walked back to where Lena and Owen were waiting, and Owen looked at my face and said, well. Get the fleet ready, I said. The Compact Council voted within 48 hours, and the vote was unanimous. I want to be clear about why, because it would be easy to misread it. We did not vote to help the Galactic Council because we had forgiven them. We did not do it because we had forgotten what they had said about us in the chamber on Veth Prime, or because the years of rebuilding had softened our memory of what it felt like to be escorted out of the building by security personnel while 43 species looked the other way. We voted yes because there were people dying on those worlds. People who had not cast a vote against humanity, who had not been in the chamber, who were living their lives on planets that were now in the path of something that did not distinguish between the species that had excluded us and the ones that had nothing to do with the decision. Innocent people on worlds with good libraries and markets that sold preserved fruit. That was why we went. Owen commanded the Meridian Fleet's engagement personally, from the bridge of the flagship compact vessel, a heavy cruiser called the Steadfast that the Meth had helped design and that carried, in its hull design, a structural material stronger than anything the Council had ever produced. I was not on the Steadfast. I was on a command support vessel about 3,000 kilometers behind the main fleet, watching the tactical displays with Lena and a rotating group of compact advisors from 9 different species, all of whom had agreed to commit forces to the operation. The first engagement was at a planet called Veth's Crossing, a Valori colony world of about 2 million people that the Kroth had put under siege 6 weeks earlier. The Council fleet was holding a defensive perimeter, taking losses, unable to push the Kroth back and unable to withdraw without abandoning the civilian population. The Council fleet commander, an admiral named Sarantath, had deployed her ships in a standard defensive formation that was, by every established tactical doctrine, correct. It protected the largest possible area with the available ships, it minimized exposure to flanking maneuvers, and it was exactly what the tactical calculation said to do. The Kroth had been attacking it for 6 weeks and making steady progress, because they had learned the pattern of the formation and were systematically finding its weakest points. Owen took one look at the tactical display when we arrived and said, quietly, to the Valori liaison on the bridge, your formation is predictable. The liaison said, stiffly, it is optimized. Owen said, optimization is another word for predictability. And predictable is another word for defeatable. He pulled his fleet into a configuration that the Valori tactical computer immediately flagged as inefficient and asked him 3 times to confirm. 3 separate points in the line were deliberately weakened in ways that looked, to any external observer analyzing the formation, like vulnerabilities. They were not vulnerabilities. They were invitations. The Kroth, who had spent 6 weeks learning to identify and exploit weak points in Council formations, moved to take advantage of all 3 simultaneously. The moment they committed to those 3 directions, Owen collapsed the formation inward in a motion that the Kroth clearly had no model for, because their response was delayed by almost 90 seconds, and in a space engagement at those distances, 90 seconds is an enormous amount of time. The Kroth force that had moved to exploit the apparent left flank weakness found itself suddenly surrounded by 3 compact vessels that had, until 30 seconds earlier, appeared to be positioned in support roles well away from the engagement. I watched it happen on the display and felt something that I had not felt in a very long time. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something more like recognition. This was the thing they had called dangerous. This was the thing they had called unpredictable. The ability to make a plan that looked like weakness and was actually a trap, to hold 2 contradictory ideas in mind simultaneously, to commit to a decision that every formal doctrine said was wrong and be right anyway. The engagement at Veth's Crossing lasted 9 hours. The Kroth withdrew. On the tactical display, a small indicator showed the Valori flagship's communication channel opening to the Steadfast. After a brief pause, Admiral Sarantatha's voice came through the open channel, directed at Owen. She said, That maneuver was not in any tactical reference I have ever studied. Owen said, "No. We made it up." There was a long pause. "I see," she said. "The following 4 months were the most concentrated period of activity I have witnessed in my life, and I have had a life that did not lack for eventful stretches. The Meridian Fleet engaged the Croth Dominion 11 times across 7 different star systems. We did not win every engagement. We took losses that were real and painful and that I still think about when I am trying to sleep. 3 compact vessels were lost in a difficult engagement near the Outer Veil's edge, and the crews of those ships were people I had met, people whose governments I had negotiated with, people who had committed to the compact when we were still a small collection of rejected species finding our footing. Their losses were not a footnote. I do not want them to be treated as one. But we held. And gradually, engagement by engagement, we pushed the Croth advance back toward the Veil. The turning point came in the 8th month. In an engagement I was close enough to watch on a visual display rather than a tactical screen. The Croth had concentrated a significant portion of their forward fleet around a transit point that controlled access to 3 inner council systems. If they held that transit point, they could resupply and advance almost at will. If we took it, we cut their forward elements off from their support and the advance would stall. The Valori assessment was that a direct assault on the transit point was not viable. The Croth position was too strong, the defensive firepower too concentrated, the approach vectors too well covered. Sarantatha's tactical staff had run the numbers 40 times and reached the same conclusion each time. Owen's tactical officer, a young woman named Petra Graves who was, coincidentally, Lena's niece and had grown up listening to her aunt's stories about the council chamber, ran the numbers once and said, "What if we do not assault it directly?" What followed was a plan that made the Valori liaison on the bridge go very quiet and still in the way that the Valori do when they are experiencing something they do not have a framework to process. The plan involved splitting the compact fleet into 3 unequal groups, sending the largest group on a very visible approach that would draw the Croth's full defensive attention, and using the remaining 2 groups to approach from vectors that were technically possible but had been dismissed in Standard Doctrine as impractically exposed. The reason Standard Doctrine dismissed those vectors was that any ship approaching from them would be detectable and vulnerable for 17 minutes before reaching engagement range. 17 minutes of exposure was considered unacceptable. Owen's response to this was simple: only if they know we are coming. The 2 approach groups traveled in complete communication silence. No active sensors. No transponder signals. Navigation by pre-calculated trajectory only. They were, functionally, invisible rocks moving at high velocity through empty space, and the Croth's sensor network, which was calibrated to detect active ships, did not register them. The Croth concentrated everything on the large visible group, which did exactly what it appeared to be doing, made a direct, straightforward assault on the transit point's primary defensive line. It was a genuine attack, not a feint. Owen had committed real ships to it and they fought hard. 14 minutes into the engagement, when the Croth's full attention and defensive resources were locked onto the primary line, the 2 silent groups hit the transit point from the unguarded vectors simultaneously. The transit point fell in 40 minutes. I watched it happen and felt an ache in my chest that was not entirely from stress. I thought about the Valori chamber. I thought about the words unpredictable and irrational and dangerous. I thought about 600 years of managed stillness that had been thoroughly unable to handle the moment that stillness was challenged by something that did not respect its rules. And I thought about what came next, because taking the transit point was not the end. It was the beginning of the conversation I had promised Thessenvor we would have. That conversation started informally, in a small conference room on the Stillpoint station, 2 weeks after the transit point fell and the Croth advance had effectively stalled. Thessenvor was there. Sarantath was there, which surprised me, and I later learned it had been her own request. Owen was there. Lena was there. 6 compact species representatives were there. Thessenvor opened by saying, "The Council wishes to formally begin discussions regarding the restoration of humanity's membership and the membership of compact species in the Council framework." I said, "We are not interested in restoration." He paused. "I beg your pardon." "Restoration implies returning to a previous state," I said. "We are not interested in returning to a previous state. We are interested in building a new one." Sarantath said, quietly, "What does that mean in practical terms?" "It means," Lena said, "that we will talk about a new council framework. Not the old one with us added back in. A new one. The formal negotiations took 8 months. I am going to be honest about how difficult they were, because it would be dishonest to suggest they were not. The council members who had voted for suspension were not, by and large, people who had acted out of malice. Most of them had acted out of something more frustrating than malice. They had acted out of genuine conviction that their existing system was correct and that anything which did not fit it was, by definition, a problem to be managed rather than a perspective to be considered. Changing the conviction, in people who had held it for lifetimes and whose entire professional identities were built on it, was not a simple process. There were sessions that ended without progress. There were moments when the Valori delegation insisted on language that we could not accept, and we said so, clearly and without softening it, and the room went cold and stayed cold for the rest of the day. There were moments when the sheer accumulated weight of 7 years of exile pressed down on me in a way that made it very difficult to sit across from the people who had authored that exile and speak to them with the patience the process required. I managed it. Most days, I managed it. The thing that made it possible was knowing what we were building toward. Not just the formal structure of the agreement, which we had outlined clearly in the first week, but the principle beneath it. The Council, for 600 years, had operated on the premise that stability required uniformity, that peace required predictability, that the only civilizations fit to participate in galactic governance were the ones that fit within existing frameworks. We were arguing, in every session, for a different premise, that stability could come from genuine representation, that predictability was less valuable than resilience, and that the diversity of approaches that the Council had spent centuries trying to minimize was, in fact, its greatest potential strength. This was not an easy argument to make to people whose civilization had been built on the opposite premise. But the Croth had done something for us that no amount of diplomatic argument could have done on its own. They had shown the Council what genuine rigidity looked like in a crisis. They had demonstrated, at enormous cost, what happens when 600 years of optimized procedure meets something that has never read the optimization manual. The memory of that demonstration was present in every negotiating session, unspoken but real, and it shifted things in ways that would have been impossible without it. The final agreement ran to 412 pages. I am not going to summarize all of it. The important elements were these: humanity was formally readmitted to the Council with full voting rights, permanent seat, and an amendment to the Charter that explicitly prohibited species classification based on behavioral characteristics. The 17 compact species were admitted as full Council members, which increased the Council's membership from 47 to 64 and, for the first time in its history, gave genuine representation to species from the outer and middle reaches of galactic space rather than just the inner core. The review board system was dissolved and replaced with a mediation council that included representatives from every member species. The dangerous species classification, which had been used to exclude or monitor dozens of species over the centuries, was struck from the Charter entirely. The formal ceremony was held on Veth Prime, in the same chamber where I had stood 7 years earlier and listened to a resonance crystal strike a brass plate and announce the end of humanity's welcome. The chamber looked the same. The tiered seats, the curved walls, the high windows that let in the pale light of Veth Prime's sun. 64 delegations now, instead of 47, and the new delegations occupied the previously empty sections of the upper tier with the slightly self-conscious dignity of people who are in a place for the first time and are doing their best to belong there without making a show of it. I stood at the floor of the chamber, at the central podium, and looked up at all of them. The High Speaker, the same one who had read the suspension decree 7 years ago, stood at the central dais. She was older. She looked, I thought, tired. Not the tiredness of someone who had worked hard, but the tiredness of someone who had spent years defending a position and had finally, at significant cost, acknowledged that the position needed to change. She read the new Charter amendments aloud. Her voice was steady and professional. When she reached the clause formally acknowledging that humanity's suspension had been issued in error and did not reflect the standards of conduct that the Council committed, in its new form, to uphold, she paused for a fraction of a second longer than the sentence required. It was a small thing. But I noticed it, and I thought it was honest, and honesty in small things matters. After the ceremony, as delegations moved through the reception area and the room filled with the careful, multilingual hum of 64 species beginning the process of learning to talk to each other differently, Fessenvor found me near one of the tall windows. He stood beside me and looked out at the city for a moment without speaking. Then he said, 7 years ago, I thought the vote was wrong. I did not know how to argue against it effectively enough. You voted no, I said. That mattered, even if it did not change the count. It was not enough, he said. No, I agreed. It was not. But it was honest, and it was recorded, and I knew it existed. That knowledge was worth something to me over those years, even when I did not know who had cast it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have been trying to understand how you did it. How humanity endured what happened without it making you into something harder. Something that could not have done what you did in those negotiations. I thought about that question carefully, because it deserved a careful answer. We were angry, I said. I want to be clear about that. We were genuinely, deeply angry. And we used that anger. Used it how, he said. We built things with it, I said. Fold space corridors. Terraformed worlds. Trade agreements and friendships with species that the Council had decided were not worth knowing. We took the anger and we turned it into energy, and we pointed that energy at the future instead of the past. He looked at me. That is the thing we could not model, he said quietly. No, I said. I do not suppose you could. Outside the window, the city of Veth Prime lay in its afternoon light, still beautiful, still ancient, still carrying 6 centuries of history in its swept curves and luminescent towers. But something in it felt different to me now. Less like a museum. More like a place that had, after a very long time, opened a window. I thought about New Carthage at sunset. I thought about Percy Hollis and Nadia Voss and the 17 species who had joined the compact when we had nothing to offer them except honesty and commitment. I thought about Petra Graves on the bridge of the Steadfast, running numbers once and finding a solution that 40 Valori calculations had missed. I thought about the 3 ships we lost and the people who had been on them, and I held that thought with the weight it deserved. And I thought about a young diplomat, 20 years from now, walking into this chamber for the first time and looking up at 64 delegations and seeing something that had never existed in this room before: space. Not the emptiness of absent voices, but the space that comes from making real room for different kinds of minds, different ways of thinking, different answers to the question of what a community of civilizations is supposed to be. Lena appeared at my elbow and handed me a glass of something cold. How are you? She said. Tired, I said. And good. She looked out the window. What happens now? Now, I said, we learn to work together. Which is harder than winning a fight, and more important, and will probably take longer than anyone wants it to. She smiled. You make it sound almost manageable. It is manageable, I said. It is just work. Owen joined us a moment later, coming from the direction of the meth delegation with a look of quiet pleasure on his face that meant he had been talking tactics with someone who appreciated them. He looked at the 2 of us, then out at the city, then back. So, he said. Did we win? I thought about the word for a moment. About what it meant and what it did not mean, and what the difference was between winning and building something that did not need winning to justify it. We did what we set out to do, I said. Whether that counts as winning depends on what comes next. Owen nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, 11 hours on the fold space corridor these days. We could be home by morning if we left now. We could, I said. But we are not leaving now, Lena said. No, I said. There is still work to do here. There always was. That was the thing about building something real, something that was not just a structure but an actual working community of different minds committed to something larger than any of them individually. It did not finish. You did not complete it and step back and say done. You maintained it. You showed up for it. You kept having the difficult conversations and the slow negotiations and the moments of honest disagreement, and you kept choosing, every time, to stay in the room. I had spent 7 years building something in what was supposed to be exile. I had watched the Council spend 600 years preserving something that had quietly stopped working without anyone being willing to say so out loud. I had watched the Croth arrive and tear through all of it without malice or ideology, just an indifferent force that exposed every fragility that 6 centuries of careful management had hidden. And now there was a new thing, incomplete and imperfect and full of the kind of promise that only shows up when people who are genuinely different agree to try. I set down my glass. Across the room, the Drell Collective's senior representative, a being I had negotiated with for 9 months and had come to genuinely respect, caught my eye and nodded. I nodded back. Near the door, 2 of the newly admitted compact species delegations were carefully, tentatively introducing themselves to a pair of long-standing council members who were making an honest effort to look welcoming. It was a small thing. It was a start. I had learned, over the course of a very long career, that everything significant begins as a small thing. A vote of 2 against 43. 11 words on a screen. A young engineer in a lab finding a solution that nobody was looking for. A fleet taking a formation that every doctrine said was wrong. Small things. Built carefully. Over time. Into something that lasts. That was the answer. I had never quite found the right words to give Thessenbor. We had survived the exile and come back and built something better, not because we were stronger than the council, or smarter, or morally superior, or any of the grand things that a different kind of story might claim. We had done it because we had looked at what we were given, which was nothing, and decided that nothing was a perfectly good place to start. The reception went on. The sun moved across the windows of Veth Prime. 64 civilizations sat in one room and learned, slowly, to begin. I stayed until the end.